Thank you very much. I did away with the blazer because these lights, it's just very warm up here. So my apologies if a tie and a blazer you were expecting. I don't think I could be able to do that today. Our topic today is an ecclesiology for multi-ethnic churches and multicultural churches. And I come out of this out of both an experiential perspective and also as kind of someone who's thinking through these things, hopefully on an academic level. And I think what I'm working through is that when I was a pastor, I mentioned this last night, that we didn't have, as we were starting these multi-ethnic churches and multicultural churches, we didn't have a whole lot of work that went into this ahead of time. For a number of different reasons. Sociologically speaking, we still had high levels of segregation in our society as well as in our churches. We still have high levels of segregation in our churches. So we didn't engage on this topic as much as we should have and could have over the years. Maybe we neglected this at the expense of the homogeneous unit principle, at the expense of churches that were kind of following church growth and seeker-sensitive service type of models. We ended up neglecting an element of a theology of multicultural ministries and multicultural churches. So I want us to think of it in those contexts of how do we understand how the church, as we are moving into the 21st century, in light of some of the things we've already been discussing, in light of incredible diversity, increasing diversity, not just in American society, but certainly in global Christianity, but also in American evangelicalism here in the United States, that we are increasingly encountering greater diversity in the church, yet we are still realizing that there is extreme levels of segregation in the church. I shared this with the doctoral colloquium this morning, that if you look at the levels of segregation in American evangelical churches, the level of segregation, according to some of the work done by Michael Emerson, the level of segregation in the American evangelical church has only been attained in American history by Jim Crow laws, so that it took the levels of segregation we have now, it took legal guidelines and enforcement of segregation to have the level of segregation we have in the American church right now, particularly evangelical churches. So we are dealing with a reality that we are just beginning to figure out, maybe for the last 10, 15 years, that it's God's will to see a more integrated and multicultural, multi-ethnic churches. But not having the tools for that. And some of that is what we discussed last night about the absence of cultural intelligence. But I would argue also there's probably a huge and significant and notable theological gap in how we understand the multicultural church, and that we are doing this maybe out of sociological pressure, maybe out of our own personal spiritual conviction. Both those things are valid. But is there a theological rooting as to why there is the importance and an importance for the multi-ethnic church? So I'll begin with the three quick examples, maybe two, depending on our time here. Let's start with two quick examples. The first example is of a conference that I had the displeasure, is that the word, of attending several years ago. And as someone who teaches in the field of church growth evangelism, I teach church planting courses. I try to make it to some of these church planting conferences. This happened to be a very significant one, a very large gathering of church planters. And, because I was kind of, that my time, there's a lot of pressure on my time, I wasn't too excited about going to the main session. I was just going to go and do my own workshop and avoid the main sessions as much as possible. But unfortunately, I had to go to the bathroom. So it turns out that the only bathrooms were not in the workshop rooms that were kind of off campus. I actually had to go into the main building to go to the bathroom. And it was at a very large church. So I'm in the bathroom and there's a main session going on. And it happens to be one of those churches that believes it is so important to hear what the preacher is saying that they pipe in the sermon into the bathroom. So now I'm forced to hear what the plenary section is actually going on in that session. And here's what I heard in this plenary session speaker. And I thought I recognized the voice. If it is the voice that I recognize, then it is maybe one of the most prominent evangelical leaders of the 20th century. Anyway, so this person was saying, the sky's the limit, so reach for the stars. And that kind of became what he kept repeating over and over and over again. So if you're a church planner, then the sky's the limit, so reach for the stars. So that kind of became the text out of which he proceeded to preach. The sky's the limit, so reach for the stars. And this was very problematic for me because I think that's not enough of a theology for us to plant multi-ethnic churches. It just doesn't feel like that's enough for us to go out and bring the gospel because the sky's the limit, so we need to reach for the stars. But I was working through this, and I was thinking through, why is it that the way we view our ecclesiology and the way we view our doing of church is rooted in this kind of possibility thinking, this idea of we can do it because we have the capacity and the possibility to do it. And maybe the second example will flesh this out a little bit more. When I received a DVD from a Christian relief organization, and the cover of the DVD said, "The poor you will not have with you," which to me was interesting because I'm reasonably certain that's not what the Bible actually says. But that's what the DVD said. So I open it up and I look through it and I find that it says, "The poor you will not have with you." And the idea is the American church, the Western church, has the resources, the capacity, the ability, the know-how, all the good things that we do as an American church to be able to stop global poverty in our generation. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I don't want to see global poverty, continue and perpetuate. But the assumptions, maybe the arrogance, the implicit arrogance of saying we, the Americans, are going to go fix the problems of the world by just setting our minds and putting our thought into it. So when we think about these images that I just gave you, this ideal of a triumphalistic perspective of the American church, we have a problem. We know how to solve that problem by putting our know-how into it. We have a situation here, and we're going to solve it by just taking all the knowledge that we have and resources that we have as a Western culture, as a rich American church, and dump those resources over there, and that will solve the problem. Whether that is poverty, whether that's the decline of the church in the West, or even maybe the way we look at multicultural churches. So that raises for me the issue of how well do we do multicultural theology. This led to an article that I read by Denise Hopkins, who teaches at Wesleyan Seminary. And Denise Hopkins was noting, and she was looking at a couple of different studies on this, was noting that if you look at the 6 major liturgical traditions in America, and she was looking at the Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, I believe the Anglican Church, look at the 6 Christian traditions in America that tend to use liturgical texts and prayer books and what is that, yeah, you know what I mean, the liturgical texts. The lectionary. And what she found was that the American lectionary was notably absent in the lament psalms. So if you take Westermann's categories of psalms of praise and psalms of lament, praise that says you praise God for all the good things that he has done, and lament psalms that says you're in a place of suffering and pain and you need God to come and rescue you. What Hopkins found was that the American lectionary, American liturgical texts overemphasized the psalms of praise and diminished the psalms of suffering, the psalms of lament, or the poems of lament. And this is universally true in our evangelical churches as well, when you think about the sermons that are given in our churches. And you can kind of flash back to my experience here at that church planning conference of this kind of triumphalistic narrative of we can do it, rather than maybe there's a problem here that we need to stay in the middle of, which oftentimes is what happens in the stories of lament. So I'm recognizing the absence of lament in the American church narrative. So I've been working for the last year and a half or so on a commentary on the book of Lamentations, because it is every academic's goal to work 2 or 3 years on a book and sell as few copies of that book as possible. And clearly a commentary on Lamentations is going to meet that goal of selling as few books as possible. And part of it is very few of us have heard sermon series on the book of Lamentations. Very few of us, I mean, we know Romans inside and out in our American evangelical churches. We have had 3 or 4 sermon series on the book of Ephesians, but very few of us have engaged in a book like the book of Lamentations, or maybe even, as Hopkins suggests, Psalms of Lament. So a lot of what I'm trying to process here is to engage in this absence of lament and the call for us, especially when it comes to the multi-ethnic churches, the multicultural churches, to embrace the theology of lament, as well as what we have already seen, which is the theology of praise. So how does that intersect together? Where the initial, so I have this kind of ministry impetus, but the theological impetus for me is coming out of the work of Walter Brueggemann. And I encountered the book Peace by Walter Brueggemann several years ago. And in that book, in chapter 2 of that book, he talks about the theology of the haves and the theology of the have-nots, and that a different theological framework and understanding of the world emerges out of whether you are a have or a have-not. The haves of the world develop what Brueggemann calls the theology of celebration, and the have-nots of the world develop a theology of what he calls a theology of suffering. And that out of those perspectives, you have a different view of shalom. You have a different view of the wholeness and fullness of God because you're coming from a slightly different reality. And so when you view shalom, the fullness of God, you are seeing that shalom in a slightly different angle. So those who are coming from the theology of celebration, what we would categorize as the haves, or those who are in places of celebration, they see the world as a relatively good place. It's a good place where we can rejoice because we have good things in the world. We see the world as a wonderful place where we receive good things. And in some sense, those who are the haves and who live in the theology of celebration really want things to stay the same. They want to maintain the status quo. They don't want tax rates to go up. They want to pay the 14.7% that Romney paid last year. So we want to maintain a particular lifestyle. We want to maintain a particular way of life because we're pretty happy with our way of life. We are the haves, and so we operate out of the theology of celebration. We don't want to change the world because the world is pretty good to us. But then if you compare that to the theology of suffering, those who are the have-nots, well, that community, when they think of shalom, the fullness of God, well, we're not even close to that. And instead of the status quo being maintained, you want the injustices to end. You want the world to be turned upside down because the way you live in the world is not the way things are supposed to be. So you can see where Brueggemann is going, that the celebration and suffering theology, they're both biblical, they're both Christian, but they are looking at things like shalom from slightly different angles. So let me give you a quick illustration of this. Let's take, for example, a story of how we view heaven. So let's go to the richest neighborhood in Pasadena. I don't know where that is, but you guys know where the richest community is in this neighborhood. It happens to be a gated community. It's where the Hollywood stars live. And we sneak into that gated community and we knock on one of the doors. And before we get arrested by the security guards of that community, a young 16-year-old girl answers the door. And we ask her, "What do you think heaven is going to be like?" And she explained, heaven is going to be a wonderful place. Why? Because she's in a place of celebration. She's one of the haves. And she says, heaven is going to be wonderful because there's going to be great things in heaven. Here on earth, I've got a dinky little Dell desktop. It does the job, but I don't like it a whole lot. But when I get to heaven, I'm getting a Mac Airbook and I'm getting an iPad. I'm getting all the best computer equipment. Here on earth, I've got a little TV set, barely gets any reception. But when I get to heaven, I'm getting a 70-inch plasma with full satellite hookup. Here on earth in the garage, I've got this little Toyota Yaris, gets me from place to place, and I can make it from one place to the other, but it's a little dinky car. When I get to heaven, I'm getting a Maserati, I'm getting a Ferrari. Now, for this young girl's perception of heaven and the world, and she's seeing heaven as good things that she has on earth, just larger versions of it, just more of it. And that makes sense because she's in the theology of celebration. And of course, you want heaven to be more of what you have on earth when you've got good things here on earth. In contrast, though, let's take a supersonic transport machine and leave that very wealthy Beverly Hills neighborhood and move to Darfur, Sudan for just a split second. And we go to a refugee camp in Darfur, Sudan. And we stumble across another 16-year-old, but in a vastly different set of circumstances. And we go to that 16-year-old and say, what do you think heaven is going to be like? And she's going to say, heaven is nothing like the world I am living in right now. Heaven is a place where my parents have not been killed by the Janjaweed. Heaven is a place where I'm not worried about getting raped every night of my life. Heaven is a place where there's actually food and water that's accessible for me. Heaven is nothing like the world that I live in because her context is out of the theology of suffering. She comes out of the have-nots. So she has a different perspective on heaven. Which is why we need both of those narratives for us to get a full picture of heaven. How do we understand heaven when you only are coming out of the theology of celebration? Or how do you understand heaven when you only have the story of suffering? You need both of those stories in order to fully understand and grasp the concept of heaven. And I would say this is our challenge in Christology as well. In our Christology, when you are coming from the place of celebration, what about Jesus' life do you just not get? Suffering. Of course you don't get it because that's not your story. You don't understand why Jesus would suffer because that's not your reality. So what do we in the West obsess about? Suffering of Jesus on the cross. We spend volumes of literature, conference after conference, beating to death, excuse the pun there, the idea of Jesus suffering and dying on the cross, because those of us who are steeped in a celebratory idea, we can't grasp in our minds what it means for a God to suffer and die on our behalf, because that's not our story. In contrast, if you go to places of suffering and you ask them about, well, what does it mean for Jesus to suffer? He said, of course I get that, because my life is suffering, and Jesus associates with my life of suffering by suffering on the cross. Why is that even in question? But the question is, but what does it mean to experience the resurrection power? What does it mean to experience the triumph of a coming king? So the questions that are asked are being different. Again, is one right and the other wrong? Or do you need both of these narratives to get a more robust, complete picture of our Christology? Because you can't have the cross without the resurrection, and you can't have the resurrection without the cross. But depending on our setting, we are going to gravitate towards one part of the story more than the other. And that's why a shalom, or a fuller understanding, is the necessary intersection of suffering and celebration, the necessary intersection of Psalms and lament. And that's where we get into the story of lament and how Lamentations really challenges us to think through outside of a triumphalistic narrative, a narrative that pushes us towards problem solving, pushes us towards quick solutions, pushes us towards, well, we have all the resources, so let's just make this work. And if we are in the place of celebration, our natural tendency is to encounter the other who is in a place of suffering and make the assumption the way we solve this relationship is taking our resources and dumping it upon that community, right? It becomes, how do we do urban ministry? Well, the rich suburban church needs to take their resources, dump it on the urban community, and run back to their gated communities. So this becomes the way we do ministry because there are assumptions about the superiority of one setting versus the other setting, and the job and task is to take the great resources of the abundance of celebration and dump it upon the inadequate resources that we think are there in the place of suffering. I think a robust theology of multi-ethnic ministry needs to recognize how much the person in celebration desperately needs the theology of suffering, and that the inadequacy of a theology of celebration desperately needs engagement with the theology of suffering. Not, yes, the converse is true. Suffering folks need the celebratory folks, but just as much, the celebratory folks needs the story of suffering. Again, which brings us back to the primacy and maybe the very high importance of a book like Lamentations. I'll know it very quickly. Most of you know the background of the book of Lamentations. It comes on the heels of the exile. Again, questions about authorship. Is it Jeremiah? Is it a whole group of authors? Both and, but that's not as critical as the idea that it seems to reflect a multitude of voices out of the community that laments the loss of the city of Jerusalem. So the Israelites have been sent away into exile. Jerusalem is the last stronghold. Jerusalem is now sent away into exile as well. And whether it's the voice of Jeremiah himself, or multiple voices that are chiming in, what we are seeing is a community that laments this suffering. And they are engaging in the sense of we have lost something here. They are clearly in the place of suffering. Now, Jeremiah does write in chapter 29 and warns the people of God who have gone into exile that there are two negative possibilities of how you're going to respond to the exile. The first negative possibility is addressed in 29 verse 4 and following, which says in saying, don't do this by doing this. He's saying, have children, plant vineyards, engage the city, seek the peace of that city. That phrase that is so often used to say, seek the peace of Jerusalem. Jeremiah says, seek the peace of that city that I have sent you into. So now what you're seeing is Jeremiah saying, you are not to disengage. That's the temptation. After all, you are in Babylon, the evil and wicked city. You're not in Jerusalem, the good and holy city. But Jeremiah uses the same phrase that he would use to seek the peace of Jerusalem. He now says, seek the peace of Babylon. So we're seeing the temptation of the people of God to disengage from the world and say, we want to have nothing to do with the world out there. We've got our own community. That's all that matters. But instead, Jeremiah calls for the reverse and says, no, seek the peace of that city, Babylon, into which I have sent you. The second option is addressed in Jeremiah 29 as well, and it shifts to the idea of divination and magic and idolatry. And it says, do not fall into that temptation again. The idea of the quick formula. Magic and idolatry were very easy formulas to comprehend. You do a particular sacrifice, you get a particular result back. It is a spiritual vending machine. It is a cultic vending machine. You put an item in, you get an item back. That was always been a strong temptation for the people of Israel. Once again, Jeremiah says, that is not an option for you. You are not to disengage with that culture, nor are you to over-engage with that culture that you become captive to the culture by operating under this spiritual vending machine paradigm. Instead, he says, I think the challenge of, instead, lament. What does it mean to stay in that place of lament? And that third option, I believe, is found in the book of Lamentation, where the celebration is informing your hope of the future, but the reality of your suffering is also being engaged. And again, it's the intersection of suffering and celebration. A quick word on the forms of this, the genre and the form of this. Lamentations is fascinating because it uses multiple Old Testament forms of lament. You see the elements of communal lament. You see a lot of elements of individual lament. It opens, in all probability, with what's called a funeral dirge, which is a communal lament, but a very specific usage of the communal lament. So the funeral dirge, the intention of the funeral dirge is not to lament and hope for a better future. This is the interesting thing about the funeral dirge. The funeral dirge, you only do a funeral dirge when there's a death. Right? You don't do a funeral dirge if you think that person is going to come to life. Hopefully you won't do a funeral for someone that is on life support. Okay, that person is going to come to life. Something has died. So you do a funeral lament when something has actually died. So it is, in my opinion, the recognition of a history, a very real history, and that clearly something has been lost here. Something has been destroyed. Something has been lost, and you need to recognize the reality of that loss. So this idea of the funeral dirge is an important concept in Lamentations because it's not, let's jump to the happy future that is to come. Although that is there, let's not jump to the happy future that is to come, but let us deal with the reality of a dead body in the room. Let us deal with the reality of a suffering that has actually occurred and deal with that story, deal with that history. If I can draw that and tie that into an illustration. The idea of the funeral dirge, I think, is an important one for American evangelicals to embrace because too often we want to get to the end of the story very fast. We want to get to the happy, I love you, man, we are the world, kumbaya, join hands and have a nice Benetton commercial in our church. That's our goal for a multicultural church, to be this wonderful, happy community that we can make a beer commercial out of. So what we've done is we have reduced the process, the ongoing work of the multicultural church into a happy-lucky-go-lucky Benetton commercial ad. And so we've jumped to the celebration. And what we have not done is what happens in the book of Lamentations, which is to stay in the story of suffering, to stay in the lament. And in what I've experienced as an evangelical and uniquely so as an Asian American, is that particularly we have glossed over the story of the African American community. We have skipped it completely, or we have glossed it to the extent that we don't need to talk about it anymore. And I would say it's similar, I'm learning similar things about the Native American story as well. So the mantra that I often hear is, well, we're going to have a multi-ethnic church, but we don't talk about all that racial history stuff, right? That happened so long ago, and you know, all these different people, that was like my great-great-great-grandparents, has nothing to do with me. So in this church, we are a post-racial, multi-ethnic church. We don't deal with the race stuff because everybody has checked their racial identity at the door. And usually we say you've checked your racial history at the door as well. One interesting side note on this, I was at a conference with Native American Theology conference, and a white evangelical stood up and said, I think it's time for us to do away with all these evangelical labels and Christian labels. You know, we're beyond these evangelical labels. We should kind of embrace a new identity and forget these Christian identity labels that have really harmed us. And it was fascinating. A Native American scholar stood up and said, I appreciate what you're saying, But ultimately, what you're doing is you are shirking responsibility for all that goes with that label. You're saying you want all the good things that go with the evangelical label, but ultimately, when it comes to embracing the history of evangelicalism, you're saying, well, that wasn't me. That was somebody else. That wasn't my story. That's somebody else's story. So is that what we're doing when we fail to lament? When we go quickly to the celebratory narrative and ignore the lament narrative, when we don't have the funeral dirge, the appropriate funeral dirge for a story because there really is a dead body in the room, because there really is a story that we have not understood, embraced, or figured out how to even engage in a positive and powerful way. So how then do we do the funeral dirge as a part of the theology of the multi-ethnic church? I'm going to kind of skip through this other stuff here. There's a couple of elements here of the city lament genre that comes out in the book of Lamentations. Again, the larger issue here in the book of Lamentations is that it uses multiple genres. And again, it goes back to use of communal, individual, city lament, funeral dirge. I think it's one of the most powerful books because it is one of the books that incorporates multiple voices. And I would argue, and I'm working through this right now, I would argue that it is one of the most feminine books of the Bible, because you see the woman's voice come out in very clear ways. Jerusalem personified as a woman. The struggles that women go through that are hurt the most. Women are, in a crisis like this, it's usually the women and children that are the most harmed in a scenario like this. The idea of the widow and the fatherless, and those are very powerful images that are used throughout the book of Lamentation, and the voices that emerge that oftentimes are the women's voices. So my opinion, more so than even Esther and Ruth, this is one of the most feminine books of the Bible, and I think it's an appropriate response for us to engage that feminine voice in the book of Lamentations. And so how then do we begin to engage these multiple voices? The presence of these multiple voices is what's actually a part of the whole narrative again. So if we're looking at a multicultural church, a multi-ethnic church, a theology is that we need both the suffering and celebration narrative, but we need also the multiple voices that fills out the picture for us. And without the hearing of these multiple voices, our theology is weak. It's incomplete. And so Lamentation gives us an example of the multiple voices emerging and to be able to sit together with the reflection of those multiple voices. I want to close with 1:15 is the... All right. I want to close with two illustrations. I want to make sure that I cover the main things that you're responding to, because I'm throwing in just some random jokes here and there that I'm not sure you're going to be able to respond to, but I want to make sure that we're covering the main basis of the paper that I presented earlier or gave to the respondents. I'll close with two illustrations. The first illustration is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is now a wonderful figure that is embraced by all Christians everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're a Protestant liberal, you're or evangelical, we all want to own a piece of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So let's just use our patron saint of ecumenism, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and engage his story a little bit. Now, again, this is a little bit of a pre-work that I'm working through in terms of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I find him to be a fascinating character, because a fascinating person, because of his story. And how the development of his theology, I believe, has a lot to do with the development of his story. So here we have an individual, if I were to use the paradigms that I've laid out for you, is clearly steeped in the theology of celebration. Right? This person is actually a child of an academic who teaches at the University of Berlin, which is kind of the equivalent of a Harvard professor of our time. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, was a chaplain in the court of the Kaiser. So here we have someone who is kind of steeped in privilege. He is able to get educated. He's a very smart guy who's able to get educated, multiple degrees, all of the stuff that goes with privilege he has. He's steeped in that celebration. And if you look at some of the very early reflections upon his life, there are not so much questions, but some reflection that possibly he was more of a nationalist than he ended up being down the road. That he was very upset when, obviously all Germans were upset when the Treaty of Versailles was handed down to the people, and the belief that that was too harsh on Germany, the sadness of the defeat that occurred in World War I, and maybe the rising up of a nationalism in that context. So that's not abnormal. That's probably the state of German society post-World War I, this crushing sense of defeat, a place of suffering, actually, a crushing sense of defeat, but also this desire to maybe recapture some of the previous glory. that had been lost at the end of World War I. So you see Bonhoeffer as one who's probably in that cultural context. And so could it be that Bonhoeffer could be someone who has what we might consider now to be nationalistic views, kind of very pro-German people, German Republic views? But how does that begin to shift? Because it obviously begins to shift. And one of the variables, maybe not the only variable, but one of the key variables is that he makes a trip to the United States, the transatlantic journey. And in the transatlantic journey, Bonhoeffer, it is very well documented, comes to New York, attends Union Theological Seminary in New York, and attends Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Some of you know Abyssinian Baptist Church is a very well-known historic Baptist church. The pastor of that church was Adam Clayton Powell. It's the very first African-American U.S. congressman comes out of Abyssinian Baptist Church. There's this very rich heritage in New York and throughout the United States. So we know now that he befriended the only African-American at Union Seminary and that they together went to Abyssinian Baptist Church. Someone who's done research on this said they went to the church and met some elderly folks who remember, oh yeah, there was some tall, blonde German guy that came to our church 60 years ago, and that was 60, 70 years ago, and that was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer attended this church. It is well documented that he read extensively about the African-American experience. Du Bois was one of his favorite authors. That he went and he purchased gospel records, LPs, and that when they started the independent seminary in Germany, he would open the class with devotionals that were based upon the gospel songs that he would play out of those records that he had purchased in the United States. So we begin to see someone who is beginning to intersect with the theology of suffering. There's some interesting evidence by Ralph Klingen, who teaches at New York Seminary, who says that it's possible that the phrase, the cheap grace, was used by Adam Clayton Powell in a sermon maybe way before even Bonhoeffer actually used it in his writings. That is it possible that it was Powell who used that in a sermon and Bonhoeffer drew from that? There's some evidence to that. It's hard to say definitively, but there's some evidence of that. So we are seeing this individual who is coming out of the theology of celebration and is able to engage in a theology of suffering and completes his theology. Well, not completes, but certainly deepens his theology, certainly expands his theology. And his whole kind of coast, down the east coast of the United States and into the Caribbean, that whole story of engaging a theology of suffering makes his Christology, especially when you read Christ the Center, you see this very human element of Christology. You see this even the idea of the limit that he poses in Creation Fall. You see Bonhoeffer engage in a very grounded type of theology, whereas the German Lutherans of the time were moving in a very abstracted type of theology. His Christology is very grounded. Does that emerge out of his experience as a person steeped in celebration, finding that connection with those who are coming from the place of suffering? So there was a question from the life of Bonhoeffer. Is our theology of multiculturalism, do we need that intersection between suffering and celebration in order to have a robust theology for that, for what we're doing as a multi-ethnic church? The second story is some of the work that I'm doing right now on Black evangelicalism. I don't think Dr. Purnell is here, but I really owe a debt to Dr. Purnell for the inspiration that he's been to me and the ways of the stories of Black evangelicalism. Over the years, I've become good friends with Barbara Williams Skinner and her insight into Tom Skinner, Tom Skinner's widow, and just the wonderful amazing testimonies that emerge out of this story. So I want to give you a little snapshot of Black evangelical history, and one of the examples where we see a failure of this intersection between suffering and celebration, which I think is critical to a multi-ethnic church. Very quickly, there was a movement in the 60s and 70s that culminates in a number of different things, and one of those is the formation of the National Black Evangelical Association, NBEA, primarily under the leadership of Bill Bentley. And so what you see in the 60s and 70s are African Americans who might have some historic Black church background, but are really steeped in the evangelical trajectory. So they go to Moody, they go to Gordon Conwell, they go to Trinity, some came to Fuller. So you have these individuals whose theological background is very much evangelical in their training. And not only that, they not only get evangelical educations, they also end up in evangelical institutions. They become the leaders and involved in, for example, Ralph Bell and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association becomes a leader in that movement. In fact, when Graham couldn't do a radio program, Ralph Bell would fill in, and Bell would actually, people would say he sounds just like Billy Graham because it was an African-American who was filling in for Billy Graham. So you see these black evangelicals who are becoming very prominent in the larger evangelical movement. You have folks like Carl Ellis, who is very key and in work with InterVarsity. So you have folks who are in Youth for Christ, InterVarsity, Campus Crusade. You're getting key African-American evangelicals whose, if you look at the face of it, say they have some deep evangelical credentials, right? They went to evangelical institutions. They're working in these staunchly evangelical institutions. Skinner has a program on Moody Radio. He's invited to Wheaton. He's invited to be a keynote at the InterVarsity's Urbana Conference in 1970. So you're seeing black evangelicals. There is no question about their evangelical cred. These are evangelicals. Education-wise, experience-wise, ministry-wise, theologically, these are evangelicals. And initially, there's a wonderful embracing, especially someone like Tom Skinner. Skinner was a gang leader whose father was a black pastor, African-American church pastor, but he really kind of rejected that world, and he was leading this very powerful gang in New York. And he was about on the eve of the greatest gang fight of his life. He hears a radio program. And he's converted by that radio program. And he goes to his gang and said, I can't lead your gang anymore. I'm going to have to leave. They don't beat him out of the gang. They let him go. And he becomes this incredible evangelist on the streets of Harlem. He goes and has streets meetings. He has these gatherings. He becomes the Billy Graham of his time in the black community. He goes to the Caribbean. He's kind of doing this incredible evangelistic work in the African-American community. And his story is amazing, right? I mean, this is kind of the great evangelistic story. He's a gang leader, and he has a radio program, and he's converted, and now he's this fiery evangelist that goes all over the place. And white evangelicals love this story. This is the story they want to hear. This is the story that they want to put out there. So evangelist by the name of Jack Wyrtzen brings them along, does these kind of crusades for about a week, and has an open night, or a night where non-whites can come in, and Tom Skinner is the speaker for that night, and he lights it up. In fact, some say that Skinner did a better job than Wyrtzen, but they love his story. He goes to every town and tells that story. I was a gang leader, but I heard a radio program and I became a Christian and I converted, and now I'm this great, and evangelicals eat this up. But then he begins to talk a little bit more about race. And if you have not heard the 1970 Urbana sermon, you have got to hear that sermon, because he lays it all out there. Now, he was doing this prior to Urbana. He was doing it at Wheaton College in 1969. He was doing it in other contexts. He was laying out a lot of this stuff ahead of time. But that was kind of the pivotal moment where there is this public declaration, in some sense, that it's not just about that I was a gang leader and I heard a radio program and now I'm a good evangelist. It was about, well, if we're going to be Christians, we've got to deal with the racial injustice piece, and we got to deal with it all. In other words, you celebratory folks have got to hear the stories of suffering. You have got to engage a theology of suffering. And so you have this moment where Skinner, who is very dynamic, very well loved by the African-American evangelicals, in a very public setting, and in one sense being embraced by the larger white evangelical movement, but also making a lot of white evangelical leaders extraordinarily nervous. Extraordinarily nervous. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is we don't want to talk about race in America. We don't want to talk about race in Christianity. The second reason that was given was we can't talk about this because if we talk about this, we really can't do overseas missions. Because if we have to deal with all the racism and injustices here, that will take energy away from the real work of taking the gospel into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So therefore, we have to not do this issue, the suffering in our home, and we have to deal with the spread of the gospel overseas. So that was actually a stated concern by white evangelicals as Skinner make this a part of his stump speech. That's the speech that he gives now, rather than the good evangelical speech that he begins to give. Now, what's interesting about Skinner is, some of you know the story, he went through a very painful divorce in the early 1970s, and that's become the scapegoat for Skinner's exit outside of evangelicalism. What I found so far is that that's not true. He didn't leave evangelicalism or was pushed out of evangelicalism simply because he got divorced. That's not the case. It was already happening prior to his divorce. Christian colleges were canceling appointments with him. Moody Radio canceled his program and brought in somebody else instead. And it went from the urban program to urban faith program. It's an urban family program. It went from the urban ministry program, and they changed the name to the urban family program. So you begin to see this movement out of evangelicalism for Tom Skinner, because the story of suffering that he was raising did not jibe with the story, the dominant narrative of celebration that we were seeing in white evangelicalism. So one additional piece of this in the next 3 minutes, of a multi-ethnic church. This church was started in the late 1960s on the west side of Chicago. Very prominent church. Newsweek actually did an article on this. It was started by a prominent white evangelical. Not at that time, he is now. So that's why I'm going to try to avoid his name. So at that time, he's a young seminary or Bible college graduate. He starts this church, and it actually becomes very multi-ethnic. Mostly white, black, but it actually draws a pretty wide swath of people from on the west side of Chicago. Now, there were two things that were unique about this church. The first thing was that this church was doing some very innovative worship things. And this is maybe kind of a precursor to Willow Creek. They were trying to do different innovative worship, incorporating the arts. And so there was this real embracing of this kind of arts and media and just creative types of worship. And the senior pastor felt this is one of the reasons we're growing as a church and drawing this kind of very unique community. The second thing was something they called the open church concept, which sounds ridiculous that it was so innovative back then, but essentially says our church is open to everybody. So, again, really? That's innovative? But back then, this was a really innovative thing in 1970, saying our church is open to anybody. We're not going to discriminate black, white. We want everybody to come into these doors. So those two things were what we might call now an innovative act by this senior pastor. And what happens is the church not only grows, it is becoming a diverse congregation. And like I said, I think it was either Newsweek or Time did a full article on this. The author ends up writing a book about this church, and it becomes a very well-known book about how do you do a church, kind of an innovative church. So what was happening, though, is that as African Americans are coming into this church in fairly substantial numbers, there's kind of this understanding of, wait, we don't have any black leaders in our church. So they hire a black leader. They hire one black leader who ends up leaving, but then they hire another black leader. His name is Clarence Hilliard. And Hilliard comes in, and he's a very active member of the NBEA. He, in fact, led the Social Justice Committee in the National Black Evangelical Association. So he has the evangelical cred, but he's also kind of part of this new group of black evangelicals that was social activism and social consciousness. So Hilliard comes into the church. Should I give the name of the other? No, well, you might be able to figure it out. So Hilliard comes in. Initially, he writes, this is a Mickey Mouse job. And I mentioned this last night. When you're kind of as a minority being asked onto a staff, you're the magic minority. And your job is to generate, and through your magical powers of being the minority, other minorities into your church. So that's what Clarence Hilliard felt this job was. I'm the magic minority asked to conjure up other minorities. And he actually called it, this is a Mickey Mouse job. They're asking me to babysit the blacks in our church. And that might have been the intention, to say, we've got blacks in the church. We need a black pastor to take care of the black members of our church. So Hilliard initially was like struggling with this, but he's beginning to think, you know what? I'm a pastor here. And his assumptions are that I'm a co-pastor here. And the white pastor is uncomfortable with that. In fact, goes to the board and says, well, we're not really comfortable with what, I'm not really comfortable. I need to be the senior pastor. And so the board says, all right, the white pastor is a senior pastor. And part of that is all the worship planning, because of the creative arts piece, or all the worship planning, including the sermon, has to funnel through the senior pastor. So now that's the scenario that's set up. Clarence Hilliard has written this very provocative sermon. The title of the sermon is Down with the Honky Jesus, Up with the Funky Gospel. I actually have the manuscript for this sermon. And it actually eventually gets reprinted in, I might have been even CT, with the title of The Funky Gospel. The part about the honky Jesus got left out. So he wants to preach this sermon in the church. And the senior pastor says, no, you can't preach this sermon in the church. He says, why can't I? I'm a pastor here. No, I'm the senior pastor here. And the whole thing kind of explodes into a very, very tense situation. And through a divine set of circumstances, I actually obtained the minutes of the board meetings for the last 6 months of this church, and it details all of the discussions that went on in this church during that time. And what you're seeing is the hesitation by the board, which was 6 whites and 1 African American, to hear the suffering story. And this is my analysis of it. I think it needs to kind of do a little more work on this, but to hear the stories of suffering and the assumption that it was the celebration piece of the church, the fun worship thing that we're doing. That's what's building the multi-ethnic church, without realizing it was actually engaging in the suffering narrative, the lament narrative that was causing this church to genuinely to be a multi-ethnic church. The rest of the story is very sad. The church kind of blows up, implodes. The white members of the church vote essentially to ask Hilliard to leave. He does leave. The African-American board member eventually resigns from the board. Most of the blacks of the church end up leaving that church. The church eventually closed its doors. Now, what's interesting to me is what happens later. Clarence Hilliard, who goes on and plants mostly an African-American church in the West Side, does well kind of as an African-American leader. We never hear about him in terms of evangelicalism. The white pastor goes on and hosts a very prominent radio program that most of us, if I said the name, would recognize. And if you go to the Wheaton archives, the section for this white pastor, there's several boxes that talk about his ministry. Very little mention of his work at this church. Most of the mention of the radio program that he did for 20, 30 years after. So just a quick side note on this. Sometimes that's why minorities are hesitant about multi-ethnic ministries. Because we go into these scenarios, and even if it doesn't work out, chances are that white pastor will find another way to make it work in white evangelicalism. Chances are the minority pastor will not be able to make it in white evangelicalism. So the question for me in this large picture with these illustrations is, what does it mean for a church to, in a healthy and constructive way, engage the theology of suffering with a theology of celebration? And is that a theological foundation for us to begin to talk about multicultural ministry? Thank you.